mysticism is that it's not really defined that well. And it seems like from what I've seen is some people try to expand the terms of mysticism to make some of their views seem more rational.
And vice versa. Some people like to take what's more rational in that sense of the term and try to dress it up as being mystical, because for some people the word mystical has a lot of where did my Mishnah class go? Hold on. There we are. For some people, the word mystical has very positive and emotional connotations. And for some people, the word rational has very positive connotations. And for some people, it's the opposite. And depending upon the audience or the passed down custom of that community, you'll find different preferences for terminology that may have no relationship on the actual content. It's just like I don't know how many people I've met who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. It's like, well, okay, that actually has almost no difference in English, but I know what you're trying to say. And what you're trying to say is that you don't understand a religion as a religion, but you still want to feel a sense of a connection to divine. And that's great. We all want to feel that connection, but don't think religion is just the bad spirituality and spiritualism is the good religion. That's not how it works. It's, I'm afraid it's my old philosophy training of you can't be too loose with your terminology, or else you're not having the same conversation with anyone else. You're each talking in your own language, even if that language happens to be English.
So that esoteric stuff they were talking about Maimonides was not a form of mysticism then, huh?
Mysticism can be esoteric knowledge, depending upon the tradition, but it doesn't have to be. Mysticism does not have, let me get my own English straight. Esoteric knowledge does not have to be mystical knowledge, and mystical knowledge does not have to be esoteric knowledge, although it usually is. Esoteric is just hidden or secret knowledge. And yes, many mystical traditions deliberately try to hide that knowledge. Others are more open about it, if you will. Usually you get something where it's open to a certain degree, but then there are levels that you access by proving your worth to receive the secret mystical knowledge. But there can be secret rational knowledge as well, which is what Rambam was arguing in that video that we're talking about, that by dint of his own logic and reason, he had been able to recreate the secret rational knowledge. And that's, perfectly plausible, as is if you're within a mystical tradition to also believe you recreate mystical tradition. That's not impossible within a mystical tradition either. All right, but you and I can continue that conversation in our time, because the people who are joining the class tonight came for Mishnah. And while Mishnah definitely has a lot to say that is very spiritual and very religious, it doesn't deal with mysticism quite as directly as someone might like. And there are lots of reasons for that we won't go into tonight. But we do need to get into the topic that we are talking about tonight, which is chapter 7. And we are going to be dealing with somebody that is not in their right mind. As I mentioned in my WhatsApp ad for this, we often throw around the phrase, he's of sound mind and body and things like that. And it becomes almost a cliche lawyer talk and almost a parody of legal talk. But as we're going to see, having a sound mind actually matters a great deal legally in Judaism. And I believe in American law as well. Although, as I've heard it said, you would have to be crazy to be a lawyer. But I don't think that's quite the legal definition of crazy. So let's talk about what happens when a person is lacking their mental faculties or is coming in and out of moments of lucidity. So we are on chapter 7, Mishnah 1. If a man is gripped by kordiakos, which is apparently a mental type illness, that means the person is not able to rationally understand or communicate what their intentions are. If they are gripped by this mental illness and say, and says, write a get for my wife, he has not said anything. Even if he adds, write a get and deliver it, that's not the issue here. The issue here is his mental capabilities. That since he is in the middle of a bout of mental illness, his words do not have legal consequence. Asking that a get be written for his wife is no different than a mentally ill person saying, I think it's going to snow in summer. It's just a non-rational, legal binding sentence, and thus we would not act upon it, and there is no obligation to act upon it. And if you did act upon it, it would not be a legal action if you did. Likewise, if he says, write a get for my wife, this is while he is not suffering from the illness, and is then gripped by Kurdiakos, as gripped by this mental illness, and then, while suffering from the mental illness, says, do not write it, his latter words are of no effect. So if he is legally sane and asks that his a get be written for his wife and delivered, is implied, and then he loses his legal state of sanity, and while in that state of insanity says, don't write it, he is trying to cancel the get, if you will. Because he is in that state of mental impairment, he cannot cancel the get. His words are nothing. They have no legal consequence. So whether it's asking to have something done while mentally ill or asking to cancel something that he began when he wasn't mentally ill, while mentally ill, the person's statements have no legal power. Is that pretty clear? Okay. Part 2. If he becomes mute and they say to him, just a reminder, muteness was a problem in many different categories or many different situations in the ancient world. This predates the techniques in the modern world, for which we are very grateful, that allow us to better communicate with those that are both born mute as well as develop mutism and deafness later on in life. Here we're just dealing with a, if you will, vanilla case of a person who has lost the ability to utter the words coherently and clearly, and thus they cannot use the phrases that we have been talking about throughout this entire Masechet. He can't say explicitly, write a get and give it to my wife. Those words are incapable of passing through his lips because of his physical impairment. So what happens? If he becomes mute and they, meaning the people with him, say to him, should we write a get for your wife? And he nods his head, meaning he is showing by a physical gesture that he agrees with that request. He is tested 3 times. If he answers no and yes properly each time, then they should write the get. So if they ask him a question and the answer should be no, and he says no, if they ask him a question and the answer should be yes, and he says yes, then it can be assumed that despite his muteness, he knows the difference between yes and no to a rational degree, and thus his request to have the get be written is honored as being legally effective. It's important to note that the rabbis considered this to be questions that needed to be asked, had to be incontrovertible. Rabbi Kolb gives the example of checking what his name is. They also give examples in the Talmud of things like in the winter, you would ask, is there fruit on the tree? If it's summer, like I mentioned before, is it going to snow? Things that a rational person would definitely know was not true. So that is, or no is true or not true, depending upon whether you're looking for a yes and a no. And after proving the test, then yes, he is legally competent. You'll note that they're not asking him to do advanced calculus. Hadn't been invented, but they're not asking for advanced calculus. They're not asking for historical information. This isn't a true-false history test. They're not asking for questions that are subjective or open to interpretation or personal opinion. You know, is chocolate the best ice cream? They're not asking those things. They're asking things that will clearly show that they are at least in touch with reality, but is not designed to prove that they are incredibly smart, capable, intelligent people. A person can still be of normal intelligence or even less than normal intelligence. That doesn't mean that they are of diminished legal capacity. Only if they can tell yes from no with questions such as I referenced. On to Mishnah number 2. And there we are. They said to him, this is back to a regular situation. We're no longer dealing with the mental impairment. They said to him, meaning a husband, shall we write a get for your wife? And he said to them, write. And then they told a scribe, and he wrote, and witnesses, and they signed. Even if they wrote it and signed it and gave it back to him, and he gave it to her, the get is void, until he himself says to the scribe, write, and to the witnesses, sign. All right, so this is a topic that we've touched on before, but it is being made even more explicit here. As always, as I mentioned before, in the modern world, and really for much of our history, we use a very strict formula to avoid this type of confusion. But here is what could happen. The man is asked, do you want us to write a get for your wife? And he says, right. Well, the explicit content of that sentence is that he wants those who are asking him to be the actual scribes, right? If I say, shall I send the letter for you? And you say, send it. What that technically means, without any implication or subtext or other implication, is that you expect me, exactly me, because I said, shall I send it, to be the one to go and put it in the mailbox. If I hand it to someone else, I haven't done what you said. Now, in most cases, like dropping something in the mailbox, passing it off to a secondary person is perfectly normal, and most people wouldn't be upset, even if, yes, honestly, it's not exactly what I asked for, but hey, it got done, and that's okay. When it comes to a get, the rabbis were adamant, that the Torah was adamant, that the get had to be given at the husband's request in the way the husband specifically asked it to be done, within the boundaries of Jewish law, of course. And that's going to be a running topic in just a few more Mishnayot. So right here, we're getting a very stark example. If they say, shall we write it? And he says, write, they don't have the option of telling someone else to go write it on his behalf. And even if that scribe wrote it, and it was witnessed, and it was signed, and they brought it back to the very husband, and he went ahead and delivered it to his wife himself, that get is not a kosher get, because he gave the instructions to the people who asked him to write it. He didn't give the instructions to the scribe directly. If he wants the scribe to write it, he has to tell the scribe to write it, and he has to tell the witnesses to sign. The agency with regards to divorce is entirely within the husband's hands. And if you subvert his agency, then the get that is written is invalid. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, does this go back to the thing where you talked about that the get has to be written at the husband's request, and if it's written without his request, he can no longer adopt it because he didn't request it to be?
Correct.
With the reason being, one would normally think that if he gave it to the wife, he adopted the get as his own, but you cannot adopt a get that had been previously written, right?
Exactly. If the get was written invalid, in this case, because it was written by the wrong person, then it is not according to his wishes. And even if he wishes to give that document to her, since the document itself is already impaired, it cannot be used as a valid get. He would have to tell the scribe directly. Now, again, in the modern world, and for much of our history, there are ways around this. The way the husband can authorize a get to be written does not have to be as specific as write or you write it. It can be you or those you designate to write on my behalf. You can add additional phrases to give yourself the wiggle room that if the first scribe breaks his hand, that he can give the work to a scribe number 2, and that scribe can do it on your behalf. This is all dealing with incomplete or flawed instructions, and that's why the results are turning out so badly. The best thing to do is have good instructions, which is what we do in the modern world. But barring that, the second best thing to do is figure out what actually is and isn't legal. We don't just go by what we think is all right. Because remember, the entirety of the concern for underlying all of the get system is, if you get it wrong, then you are essentially leading people to adultery. If you don't do what the Torah asked, when the Torah said how a divorce should be run, then that means people weren't divorced, and when they get remarried, which was the most common thing in the ancient world, they would be getting remarried and committing adultery. So the rabbis very much want to make sure that we get this exactly right according to the Torah's directions. All right. Mishnah 3. And now we are going to get into a topic that will feel a little odd if you're not used to legal questions or even just conditional situations. And that is a question of retroactivity. We've talked briefly before that for some reasons, most notably Levirate marriage, the marriage to the brother that we talked about in Yibum, that for some situations, a husband might rather his wife were divorced from him before his death than be widowed from him. And that's definitely true from war or long distance travel as well, where there might be no evidence that he has died, and thus she would be stuck married to him in absentia. But how does that work? How can you retroactively change a person's personal status? How do you put something in place that will eventually meet a condition, which will go back in time and then unravel that situation so that there is no problem in your present? It's a little bit of a head scratcher. So we're going to take it through step by step, and we're going to start off here in Mishnah 3 with doing it wrong. That is to say, the first part here in Mishnah 3 is going to show us how not to set this up, how not to create a system where the woman would be divorced upon the husband's death rather than rather than be a widow upon his death. Okay, so let's get to the text. If a husband says, "This is your get if I die," or "This is your get if I die from this illness," or "This is your get after my death," he has not said anything. Why? Because all of these phrases imply that the get only becomes a get once his death happens. Once his death takes place, then it becomes a get. But that's a problem, because as we have talked about in a couple other places in this Masechet, a dead man can't give a get. Once you are dead, the get cannot take effect. A get cannot be issued, nor can it be delivered after a husband's death. So by putting these phrases together in this manner, where it looks like if I die, then this becomes a get, that means that when he dies, the get cannot take effect, and instead she is a widow. And if that's what they're trying to avoid, then we've got a problem. All right, so I just want to make sure everybody's got it clear why this doesn't work. The get cannot become a get after his death. Now, obviously, that's going to lead us into the next part, which is, well, if the get can't become a get until after his death, then it has to become a get before his death. But how can that be conditional then? How do I make a "if I die, it's your get" work with that taking effect before I die? Because I don't want to divorce you if I don't die. How does this work? All right. If he says, "This is your get from today if I die," or "This is your get from now if I die," the get is valid. So by introducing the phrase from now or from today, he is putting an anchor down, a chip on the table, and saying, the get will become a get upon my death, but the get is already a get here, waiting to be activated, if you will, upon the fulfillment of the condition. So the get is not created when he dies. The get is retroactively approved of when he dies from having met that condition. Now, this may seem like a very fine detail, and I will admit that it is. But what the rabbis are trying to say here is that the get has to be set up so that it is in the husband's mind that from this point, the day when the get is being given to her to hold on to, that he is potentially divorcing her. They're not divorced yet because he's not dead, but the potential for divorce has become real. It's like lifting my pen, right? Once I do this, I have potential energy. I have created the potential for this pen to drop, and the energy is now stored in the pen, waiting for me to let go, and then it will plummet back to earth because of gravity. I have to create that potential first before it can be primed to be activated by me letting go. What the husband is doing here is creating that potential by saying it is from this moment forward, he's turning the get on and it is now charged. It's just not actually enacted. That will happen when he dies. That will happen when the condition of the get is met. As we'll see, there are other conditions that we'll discuss. Okay, is that distinction relatively clear? All right, next part. If he says, this is your get from today and after my death, it is both a get and not a get. If he dies without offspring, she must perform chalitza, but she cannot marry the husband's brother. She can't do yibum. All right, so here we have the worst of both worlds because the guy is talking like an idiot. So he gives her the get, and he says it's from today. Great, that sets it up to be a retroactive get, no problem. And then he adds, because apparently he can't shut up, and after my death. Well, which did he mean? Did he mean that it's a get from today, meaning it's one of these potentially primed, retroactively enforceable gets? Or did he mean that it's an after my death get, which doesn't work because dead men don't give gets? He said both phrases in one sentence, at which point we, those who have to interpret his words, are left with a paradox. It is a get and it's not a get. Perhaps he really did mean from today, if I die, at which point it is a proper get, and she would not be allowed to marry her husband's brother. On the other hand, he really might have meant it's only a get after my death, at which point he has said something legally impossible, at which point she is still married to him until his death, and thus she becomes a widow, and she should have to marry the husband's brother, but because that might not be what was meant, she has to do chalitza because she might have that bond, but she is not allowed to fulfill that the yibum process. So think before you speak. Get a rabbi's opinion and ruling before you open up your mouth. Follow the script, because yes, saying things wrong can put this whole legal process into jeopardy. In a similar vein, but a slightly different case, let's see if I can get, yes, that's all on. If he said, this is your get from today if I die from this illness, all right, we've got a nice, good, potential primed retroactive get. If I die from the illness, then the get will take effect from this day that I'm giving it to you right here, right now. But then he got up, which is a sign of health in Judaism. When a person gets up, that's a euphemism for once you get out of bed, you're feeling better. And he went about, he walks around, he's clearly showing that he's not ill. And then he fell sick and died. All right. We estimate the probable cause of his death. We have to figure out, well, what killed him? If he died from the first illness, then the get is valid, because he said, if I die from this illness, this is your get. But if we think the first illness was okay and he got better, and then the second illness was a different illness and he died from that, then that get doesn't count because he died from a different cause. And as such, she is still considered a widow. Now, if it is doubtful, if there's no way to tell the difference, like the first illness was appendicitis, and the second illness was a completely unrelated neurological disease, or something that he contracted, like COVID, for example. And if we're very, very clear which one killed him and which one didn't, we might be okay. But if it's unclear what exactly he was dying from, he went into the hospital with heart problems, and they did surgery on him, but he didn't recover. Did he die from the heart problems or did he die from the surgery? It might not be clear. And at which point we're back into the case of maybe she's divorced, maybe she's not. And we have to do chalitza if there's a brother around and not allowed to do yibum. All right, question? Okay. So, right, yes, there we are. I have to look for the bold text to find where we actually begin. So Mishnah 4 is actually a continuation of Mishnah 3, because we've discussed what happens when he creates this conditional setting vis-a-vis his wife and saying this will be your get, or this is your get if I die from today, blah, blah, blah. Well, what happens to the relationship between them in the meantime? He tells her, if I die from this illness, then this is your get from today. Okay. Is she divorced or not? Well, we in the present don't know, right? This is the time travel paradox. At some point in the future, he will or won't die from this illness. If he eventually dies from this illness, then that condition being met causes the get to have been a true get from that moment that he gave it to her, at which point she technically isn't married to him in that period of time between the giving of the get and his passing away. On the other hand, if he doesn't die from that illness in the future, then during that same time period, she is still married to him. We, the people living in the present, don't know. Only the future people will know, but they can't call the past and tell us what happened. So what is her relationship to him? Is she divorced or not divorced while waiting to see if he dies or comes back from his trip or gets killed in the war or any of the other times a conditional get might be given? Well, part 2 is going to answer, Mishnah 4, part 2 here with Kolb's translation is going to give us our answer. She, the wife during this conditional period, should not be alone with him except in the presence of witnesses. Even a slave or a handmaid, meaning any witness is sufficient, even if they're not normally a witness that is considered suitable for a court, except for her own female slave, her own personal handmaiden, since she can take liberties in front of her own handmaid. All right, so what's the issue here? Well, there are two issues that are discussed. One is that if they are divorced, meaning that he will eventually die, and that means retroactively she is a single woman during this time period. If she is with him alone, well, technically that is prohibited, right? For her to be alone with a single man that isn't her husband is, provocative and not a good idea. So that would be considered yichud, and that would be, shall we say, strongly frowned on. But there is another, even more serious, in my opinion, potential problem, which is, well, she and her husband are rather familiar with each other, what with being married. And they don't really feel divorced, since after all, this is just a conditional divorce. And it's quite probable that they'll get up to hanky-panky, that they will be intimate with each other during this hypothetical period. Well, if they are intimate with each other during the hypothetical period, then that intimacy could be considered an act of kiddushin, an act of betrothal. And if there was a second act of betrothal, then a second get would be needed. Trying to sort out the timeline here is a little tricky, so follow the bouncing fingers. I'll see if I can get the bouncing fingers to work, but it's sometimes hard with the green screen behind me. So let's see if I move it from here to there. Let's see if we can get that to work. So he gives her the get saying, if I die from this illness, this will be your get. In the future, he dies. That means it was indeed a get. Sometime after the get was given, but still to these people, they're unaware that it was going to become a real get, he and she sleep together. Well, because they were technically single, retroactively speaking, as we will find out, that means that their intimacy could be considered an act of bia for consummating a betrothal. That means they're actually married. Between here and here, they weren't married because the get had become real thanks to what happened in the future, but then they slept together and now they're married again a second time because of their intimacy during this period. Because of that, before we get to his death, there would need to be another get written to take into account that second betrothal that happened because of the intimacy while they were in this contingency time period. All right. Aaron, you've got a question? I am not surprised. I expect lots of questions about this because it is very convoluted.
My question is, if she's married, then divorced, then there's a death. Does she get two ketubas?
She's married and then divorced, and then no. She would only get the one ketubah in any case.
How come she doesn't get the ketubah from the get and then another one from?
Are you talking about the previous cases where it was she might be married, she might be divorced?
No, I'm talking about the one where they have relations. So he gives her the get, it's a valid get, then they have relations, and then he dies.
So the okay, let me work out then the hypothetical. So isn't it like she got married to him twice and the estate never paid her for the first get before she got married again? If that's the idea, that she's basically got married before the estate settled the debt for the first get.
Right.
So, okay, yeah, it's an interesting question. It's not one that I've studied. My first answer would be that we're working off a hypothetical kiddushin in the first place. That is to say that their act of intimacy during this contingency period is considered to be an act for the sake of marriage. Now, that can be hand-waved technically by the rabbis in extreme circumstances. That's how the nullification of a marriage can take place. But they would probably also imagine that if they're constructing a hypothetical in the first place, that hypothetically, she would have waived a right to a second ketubah, that she would not have been demanding additional compensation for that second marriage, because she probably wouldn't have been viewing it as a second marriage. As such, I would say that you wouldn't assume automatically that a new debt had been accrued because of that second intimacy. Like I said, the rabbis here are much more worried about any potential damage to the get, because if you get a get wrong and you allow a woman, in this case, to go free because her husband has died, when she should have been bound to a brother-in-law through levirate marriage, through yibum, then you are creating the potential for adultery. They are less worried about double dipping on ketubas and much more worried about that potential adultery. So yes, it's a fine question and one that I hadn't considered, but I think the rabbis would say that's not the primary concern here.
So it'd basically enacting a leniency because it's to
It would be more of enacting a stringency with a very narrow scope and thus not creating additional stringencies in the process. So the stringency is the hypothetical second marriage that happened during their seclusion. The stringency that might go along with that would be a hypothetical additional ketubah, but the rabbis are not interested in creating that hypothetical stringency alongside the hypothetical kedusha. Again, this is off the top of my head. If somebody has knowledge of a poskim that have said there should be a double ketubah, I'm always happy to read that and find out. Continuing with this topic, however, we then have to figure out, well, what is her status like then? What does she count as? Is she married to him during this time period? Is she not married to him during this time period? It's like, okay, we're still husband and wife, but we might not be because, the future, who knows what has happened in the future and how that would change our situation. So what the Mishnah tells us about this is, what is her status during those days? Rabbi Yehuda says that she is regarded as a married woman in every respect. Rabbi Yossi says that she is both divorced and not divorced. So in phrasing that we are probably used to by now, we end up with this potential paradox of being both A and not A, and also with the idea that she is married, but she's not exactly married. So the answer that Rabbi Yehuda is giving is that really the woman should be treated as though she is married this entire time, basically because we don't know yet. We can't look into the crystal ball. There is no evidence that he does or doesn't die, and therefore, until we get that evidence, she should be treated as though she was married. As Rabbi Kolp points out, it seems then that Rabbi Yehuda is disagreeing with that previous clause that says they shouldn't be alone together. Excuse me. And it goes without saying that he would also agree that she could eat truma or benefit in any other way from her status as being married. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, and I'll just put his commentary up here for those that would like to read along. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, says no, that she is not considered to be married and she is not considered to be divorced. And this is kind of the worst of both worlds. She is not given total freedom to do whatever she feels like, certainly not going and being with another man, but she also doesn't have the right to eat truma or even to be with him during this time period. So she is trapped during this time, waiting to find out what her status will have been once it is clear whether he lives or dies according to the conditions of the get. All right, what do we got? 7.5. I think we're going to be able to finish chapter 7 tonight. Of course, every time I say that, we always end up not. But I think we're going to be able to finish because it's continuing along the same vein and we are doing our conditions and it seems like we're getting a handle on this. So here's hoping. If the husband says, this is your get on condition that you give me 200 zuz, that's money, and she is divorced and she has to give him the money. So in that particular case, if she gives him the money, she is divorced. If she doesn't give him the money, she is not divorced. And that is something that might make you feel uncomfortable. In the modern world, there has been a problem with men trying to extort settlement arrangements, or other monetary compensation during a divorce proceeding in a secular court to the detriment of the wife, telling her, if you waive the rights to alimony, then I'll give you a get. It's a little different than this because obviously that is not playing in the Jewish court rules. But essentially, a get given on any condition will only be fulfilled when that condition has been met. And that is going back to what we've been saying now consistently throughout chapter 7, which is the words that are used, the terminology that is used, the conditions that are set have to be followed to the letter to be sure that we are actually complying with whatever instructions the husband gave. Is it right for a husband to put a condition on the get that is to the financial disadvantage of the wife? No. And indeed, she could choose not to give the money. Now, the get would then be invalid. She would not be considered divorced, but that is her prerogative. And then he would have to decide whether he wanted to remain married to her and continue to have to support her, or divorce her with a get that doesn't have such a ludicrous condition that is placed upon it. But if the condition is in place and the condition is met, that the get is valid. If the condition is not met, the get is not valid. Likewise, if he says, on condition that you give the money to me within 30 days from now, if she gives him within 30 days, she is divorced, but if not, she is not divorced. So in this case, he gives her a particular time window rather than just saying, give me money. If she gives the money within that time period, she is divorced. If she gives the money later than that time period, then she is not divorced.
Rabbi,
Yes.
is there a time period for the first one where they didn't specify one?
There isn't a time, right? There isn't a time period, but there is a moment of accepting the debt, if you will. So it isn't within a time period. Now, this is actually argued about in the Talmud, where they say that the reason, you might think rather, that the reason he said within 30 days was to try and hurry up the payment. And that if she didn't get it within 30 days, the husband might be okay with giving her an extension. But the Mishnah is very clear, as is the halakha. If you say it must be within 30 days, even if you intended that to just be a way of trying to spur action, if it doesn't happen in 30 days, that get is no longer valid and you're still married. So once again, say what you should say and handle it as you should handle it, because trying to play games makes things worse. You don't play games in life, and you should definitely not play games when it comes to divorce. Yes, Eric.
My only question is if there's no time frame put on the 200 zoos, she might just give him 200 zoos in the course of regular living over 10 years and be divorced and not.
Well, it would be a lien upon her. It would be a debt. And it's not coincidental that 200 zoos happens to be the average ketubah payment. So this could be very much like saying, give me 200 zoos, which means he would hand it to her and she hands it back to him. It would be a way of him getting out of the divorce for free. But again, if she does not agree to it, if she does not consent to make that payment, then the get is null and void and there is no divorce.
So she can't give him the 200 zoos on accident, namely giving him, 5 a year or 10 a year for 20 years?
That would have to be a determination of the court of if she wanted to pay but didn't have the means, just like any other debtor. They would have to work out what kind of method would be used for settling the debt. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel on the same topic says, it happened in Sidon that a man said to his wife, this is your get on condition that you give me my robe. And his robe was lost, right? It's gone. And the sages said that she should give him its value in money. Now, this is an example where the Talmud goes into a little bit more depth. It believes that there was a missing part to this Mishnah, another opinion before Shimon ben Gamliel that says that if he said, give me the cloak, and there is no cloak, then there is no divorce. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is arguing, no, when he said my cloak, what he really meant was the value of the cloak, and that would be good enough. The halacha is not according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. If he says, give me the cloak, and there is no cloak, you need to make a new get. Right? The rabbis are not really messing around. And you can see that while they make leniencies for mental conditions and mutism and other such things that could be beyond a person's control, they are not playing fast and loose with the language that's going on here. They want it to be done correctly, clearly, and in a way that cannot be argued about later because of the implications of adultery being, well, just too easy if you make a mess of this. Continuing with our stipulations and our conditions, we're going to talk about providing care. Now, like we said in the last Mishnah, even more so in this Mishnah, we are talking about, as Rabbi Colt put it in his introduction, blackmail. That the husband is trying to divorce his wife in such a way that he can continue to extort additional service from her, that she will become a servant for a particular time period-ish, and that will be a condition of her divorce, which she might be eager to have. Again, multiple times I will say this throughout my my classes on this Gittin and many other topics as well. The law is not here to tell us what you should do. It is telling you what to do if this is what has happened. The same way that we have laws on the books that say what happens if somebody murders, we have laws on the book that says what happens if someone makes a conditional statement with their wife that is essentially blackmailing them into service. How do we handle that? And you may not be happy with the outcome of the ruling, but the rabbis weren't happy with this kind of behavior either. And there would be other ways to try and force him to give a get that was not burdened with this type of conditionals. But if those conditionals are there, this is the problem, which of course is trying to show you, don't put these conditions there. Don't allow the husband to put these conditions there. If he does put these conditions here, force him to write a get without these conditions. That being said, let's do the halakha. If a husband says, this is your condition, this is your get on condition that you look after my father, or on condition that you nurse my child, how long must she nurse? 2 years. Rabbi Yehuda says 18 months. So there's a disagreement about how long she has to remain a wet nurse, but that seems to be limited by the normal course of nursing. A reminder that in the biblical and ancient world, a child was essentially part of its father's household first and last as its status. That was because of the way inheritance worked, and as such, the woman did not receive custody in any of these cases. Up to and including the death of the husband, the child would become the custodian of the rest of his family, not hers. We can talk about that why and how another time if you are interested, but just understand that he's divorcing her. She will continue to nurse the child until it is weaned, and then that child goes to his household, and that's it. The father condition, however, is even more complicated because he says, look after my father. He does not stipulate a time period, and as such, it becomes the father's lifetime. Now, if the father is very old, she may be thinking, he just wants me to look after his father for the next few weeks, but technically, he didn't set a timeline. As such, he could be trapped for considerably longer looking after his father. Which brings us to, if the child dies or the father dies, the get is valid. Because the stipulation was, you will have your get on the condition that you look after them. If she looked after them, but they died, she has fulfilled that get. She weaned, or she nursed the child while the child was alive. She looked after the father while the father was alive. The fact that they're dead now doesn't mean that she failed. She fulfilled the condition. Therefore, the get is valid, and she can be rid of this jerk and never have to talk to him again, we hope. But what if we change the language slightly? If he says, this is your get on condition that you look after my father for 2 years, or on condition that you nurse my child for 2 years. If the child dies, or if the father says, I don't want you to look after me, even though she has not caused him to complain, the get is invalid. Right? The problem here is that there was a condition based upon time. That time was not fulfilled, either by the death or by a decision from the father, but not from her. and that means that she was then unable to fulfill her term of duty. As such, the condition was not met, the get is invalid. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says something like this is a get. He argues, nah, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said a general rule, whenever the obstacle does not arise from her side, the get is valid. He is trying to err on the side of allowing her to be free, despite the condition not technically being met. But that is a very difficult position to take, because as we have seen, the rabbis are very eager to make sure that there is no room for arguing over the get. And that means if the get is not fulfilled, if the conditions are not fulfilled, even if the intent or otherwise, circumstances seem to be in her favor, nevertheless, the condition wasn't fulfilled. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, I know that they tear these gets up and give you the certificate of divorce. Is the husband allowed to voice his complaint if something like this happens and they had torn?
So is the husband allowed to voice his complaint? Yes. Is it welcome within the community? Generally not. Now, it took until Rabbeinu Gershom to make a full takana that nobody should ever make any disparaging remarks about a get once it had been delivered. But that's only 1,000 years ago. Prior to that, while it was frowned upon and dissuaded, and it was bad form within the community, that wouldn't legally prevent a person from making a stink. Would that actually be ever adjudicated? Would she actually be accused of being adultery in a court of law? Maybe yes, maybe no. But of course, the bigger problem wasn't whether she went to court. The bigger problem was, what would her status in the community be? And that's why Rabbeinu Gershom put in a takana saying, no, if you have a problem with the get, you say it before it's delivered. Once it's delivered, we're done, because we are not causing these gossipy problems in our communities. And in fact, if you do, then you will be under cherem, you will be excommunicated. You will be driven out of the community if you attack a get that was given.
Yeah. And the example I was giving was like the one for the 200 zoos. I'd give you a get if you give me the 200 zoos. Let's say they tear up the get and she asks for a ketubah and he says, what about my 200 zoos? Can he say you never gave me the zoos, or does she just have to give it the 200?
So then, yes, if the conditions of the get have not been fulfilled, then that unfortunately would still be a grounds for a court case to see whether it was a valid get or not. That's why you shouldn't be putting conditions on a get. That's the difficulty with all of this. It just creates too many openings. And 7-7, we're going to do more openings with some traveling issues. If a husband says, this is your get if I do not return within 30 days. Remember, travel could be dangerous. And he was going from Judea to Galilee. If he got as far as Antipatris and then returned, his condition is broken. If he says, this is your get and I do not return within 30 days, and he was going from Galilee to Judea, and if he got as far as Kefar Otnai and then returned, the condition is broken. If he said, this is your get if I don't return within 30 days, and he was going into foreign parts, if he got as far as Akko and then returned, his condition is broken. So what we're talking about here is that if you just reach the edge, if you just get to the edge and return, then the condition is broken. That the condition is severed the moment it has been reached. It doesn't have to be the farthest or the deepest or the whatever. It just, once it's there, it's there. That if he didn't even make it to the destination. So, for example, Antipatris was considered to still technically be in Judea, and Kefar Otnai was still technically considered to be in Galilee. That if he didn't fulfilled the condition of traveling, of going, of getting to his destination, then that also breaks the condition, and that means the get is not a real get. Just get down to the next part. If he said, this is your get as long as I shall keep away from you for 30 days, meaning if I am gone from you for more than 30 days, even though he came and went, since he was not secluded with her, the get is valid. So the idea here is saying that keeping away from you means not being intimately in your presence. And at such point, as long as they were not secluded, even if they still saw each other, as long as they were not actually together, meaning privately, then the get indeed takes effect. And let's just bang out 7, 8. I think we can as well, because it's the same topic, basically. If a husband says, this is your get if I do not return within 12 months, and he dies within 12 months, it's not a get. If he says, this is your get from now, if I do not return within 12 months, and he dies within 12 months, it is a get. Once again, we are seeing that a conditional get, which will take effect retroactively, needs a retroactive anchor to hold on to. You have to say from now. If you don't say from now, then you didn't actually stipulate the anchor, and that means the conditions don't work. If you say from now, then you've primed it, and now it will become effective. And 7.9, as we wrap up chapter 7. If a husband says, if I do not come back within 12 months, write a get and give it to my wife. And they wrote a get before 12 months, 12 months had passed, and gave it to her after, it is not a get. So again, we're talking about him assigning the job to someone else to write the get. And he tells them, if I don't come back within 12, write the get and write my wife. The implication is, after the 12 months have passed, they should write it. But they got an early start. They wrote it before the 12 months had passed. As such, they were not following his instructions to the letter, and the get is not valid. Write a get and give it to my wife if I do not come back within 12 months. And they wrote it before the 12 months had passed and gave it after. It is not a get. Right? So once again, they are saying that because he gave the stipulation of give it to my wife after 12 months, it would need to be done then. But because it could be argued that the give it to my wife if I don't come back within 12 months is the only part of the instructions that are being modified by 12 months, then the writing prematurely might not be a problem. And indeed, Rabbi Yossi argues that indeed, that's not a problem, and it is a kosher get. But because it is still ambiguous that the within 12 months could have been applied to both parts of the sentence, the writing and the giving, the rabbis do not feel this is a valid get because it was written prematurely. Again, trying to remove all doubt. If they wrote it after 12 months and delivered it after 12 months and he died, if the delivery of the get preceded his death, the get is valid. But if his death preceded the delivery of the get, it is not valid. So if they do all of it right, and they write it after 12 months, and they deliver it to her after 12 months, and then they find out that he died, well, if they know that the get got to her before he died, it is a valid get. If it got to her after he had died, it is not valid because dead men don't give gets. If it is not known which was first, this is a woman about whom they say she is divorced and not divorced. So like we talked about earlier, she is trapped in this in-between world of having to do chalitza in the case of yibum, because she might be divorced, at which point she definitely can't do yibum, but she might not be divorced, at which point she definitely still has an obligation. So chalitza is the escape route that is used to make that work out. And that is the end of chapter 7. Only 1 minute over time. So we will pick up with chapter 8, which will deal much more with the actual delivery of the get, of how the get gets to the wife, and not just the agency and the timing, but the actual physical delivery. Thank you all for studying with me, and I look forward to getting together again for our class next week or any other time. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks for